Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar. As part of Earth Day Live, today is day and it's Stop the Money Pipeline. Today, we will be diving into divestment and how that impacts us, our planet, and how we take action to make a difference. We have 4 speakers that will introduce themselves shortly, and they will share their first-hand experiences with the divestment movement by giving relatable stories that can inspire us to take action and collectively look at the victories and power of this movement to really bring about significant change. So Jack, if you'd like to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Jack Lieberman. I'm the chairperson of our South Florida chapter of 350, South Florida chapter of 350.org or 350 South Florida. I participated in the first Earth Day 50 years ago at Florida State University, where I was a student at the time. And I've been active in environmental struggles over the years. For example, the anti-nuclear protest around 3 Mile Island and a number of other activities. I also was a leader in the anti-Vietnam War movement and also very active in the divestment movement. And I'm going to be against South Africa apartheid. And I'm going to be drawing some lessons from those struggles to what we're doing here today.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you. If Eric would like to introduce himself.
My name's Eric. Whoops. Okay, you see, my name's Eric. I'm a board member of 350 South Florida. I've also been involved with the Greenpeace for many years, on and off, as a local activist. Yes, I will be talking about the sort of 3 pillars of fossil fuel financing. How basically Wall Street and the big money and big corporations are able to get these massive infrastructure projects funded with largely our money.
Thank you, Eric. And now, Diana, our third speaker, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Diana Umpierre, and I work for Sierra Club as an organizing representative. And I will be sharing today, after a wonderful introduction to divestment and all these people that are bad actors, what alternatives do we have for moving our money, as well as share some things that we can do today via social media and other means to put pressure on the bad actors.
Thank you very much, Diana. I will also be presenting. I'm Nicole Level with 350 South Florida, and I will be sharing my personal experience with the divestment movement when I was a university student in Vancouver in the University of British Columbia. And I will also be sharing other university victories on divestment and how the divestment movement is growing. So thank you to all our speakers. After each speaker presents, the audience is encouraged to participate and ask questions at the end of each speaker. Please write your questions in the chat box just to the right.
5.5 by 8.5. It said it would be ready at 4.
And so without further ado, we'll start our presentation. Thank you all for being here. So welcome to our divestment webinar. Before we begin, we would like to share this coalition action that had over 20 different groups involved across Florida that came together a month prior to collect all these climate selfies of activists around Florida in solidarity with the Earth Day movement and with the Stop the Money Pipeline movement. So our message as Floridians is no fossil fuel bailout. So without further ado, I'd like to dive us into divestment.
Yeah, so What is divestment? Well, we know about investment. Investing is when you put your time and money and energy into something that you want to pay a dividend in the future. Usually with money. It involves investing in stocks, bonds, or in some cases things like real estate or gold or whatever. The idea being, you want your investment to grow over time and yield a benefit. And that can be financial or, social benefit. I mean, we're investing our time doing this in the hopes of a better future. So divestment is just the opposite of that. It is literally taking your money, your time and energy out of something that is probably not going to pay a dividend or might actually be a risk or a loss in the future. And it's pretty clear that fossil fuels are a really bad risk for the climate, for our future, for also the economy. If we look at what's happening with the crisis right now, the COVID-19 crisis, that is just a small disruption compared to what the climate crisis can cause. So think about the impacts of the economy that we're facing right now, magnify that, a couple hundred times, and that's what we're going to be looking at if the climate crisis continues. So fossil fuels are a bad investment for not just our future, but also financially. It's not a good, long-term investment. So the divestment movement is literally just getting people to pull out their money from fossil fuel companies. So what, a lot of people might think, okay, well, I don't particularly own stock in ExxonMobil or coal companies or whatever. But the thing is that a lot of investment firms do. So you have mutual funds that are run by a number of different, organizations and companies, and all of pretty much any kind of pension or university endowment or nonprofit endowment, all of these things, religious church endowments, all of these pools of money need to be invested in something so that they continue to yield dividend over time. And unfortunately, a lot of those portfolios include fossil fuels. And this movement is really just to call attention to that and get that money pulled out of there and put into renewable and much better investments for the climate and for the future. So we want to do the next slide here. So far, the fossil fuel divestment movement has been gaining steam. $14 trillion has been divested from institutions, from fossil fuels, by various institutions. And you can see the sort of breakdown there. A lot of them are, nonprofits or faith-based or educational institutions, in some cases governments or pension funds. And in addition, we have about $5 billion just from individuals divesting. So that's like literally dumping your ExxonMobil stock. So this is definitely a movement that is growing, and certainly the number one thing that these bad actors pay attention to is who's investing with them. And if we shut off the flow of money to them, then we are going to be able to have a very strong impact on whether or not additional fossil fuel projects get approved. Clearly, the government, trying to put pressure on the government to regulate is certainly important. But if we can go after the corporations directly and hit them where it hurts, which is the pocketbook, then we can sort of bypass that whole regulatory step, which unfortunately can take a lot of time. And in this administration, we're seeing some major setbacks. So that's what divestment is in a nutshell. We'll be going into some examples in just a bit. If anyone has questions, please type them into the chat, and we'll get to those as appropriate.
Thank you, Eric, very much. And now Jack will lead us into what the movement is and also his personal experiences.
One of the main things I want to stress here is that wherever there have been struggles for social justice and fundamental change, It's only happened from the bottom up and through mass action. And besides, getting legislation passed or corporations to divest, or let me put it this way, getting legislation to be passed or corporations to divest only occurred after there was massive upheaval on the outside of the organized government institutions. And even, I would even say, the establishment institutions. If we go back to the 1960s, where I was a student activist, like I said in my introduction, I participated in the first Earth Day. I was a leader of a group called the Student Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam. And at that time, our main focus was fighting the war. In fact, ironically enough, some of us even believed that Earth Day was an attempt by the establishment to get young people involved in a less toxic, less controversial issue, because everybody ostensibly was against pollution, which is mainly initially what Earth Day was about. Nobody was thinking about fossil fuels, and that's even before we knew about the problem with the ozone layer from aerosols. It was way back. But at that same time as Earth Day happened, there was upheavals all around the country on campuses, basically to force divestment from the military-industrial complex, from supporting the war in Vietnam. I myself was arrested and suspended from school for protesting against military recruiters on campus, against ROTC, which is Reserve Officer Training Corps, because that's what fed people into the war machine and indoctrinated into the war machine. And at that time, there was a big move also to stop corporations from doing research on campuses. A lot of people may not know this, but one of the most famous upheavals in the 1960s carried out by Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, which I also was a member of, at Columbia University. One of the main thrusts of that whole protest was to stop military research on the campus. And today, if we're going to get universities to divest, and also I think a focus should be to stop research supporting the whole fossil fuel industry, it's going to take mass action on the campuses with students and their allies in the community and the labor movement and so on. And we've begun to see some activity around that. Hopefully this pandemic is a little bit of a wake-up call, because it shows that if you wait till the last minute to deal with the crises that's been building up, which in reality, if you know the background about the pandemic, this has been building up for a while, and there have been warnings about it for a while. We have the same situation with Earth Day. With our Earth and with global warming. It's not politically expedient, nor in the short term does it seem to be economically expedient for them to take action now around the climate. But when the climate crises come to a head, if we haven't taken the kind of action that we need in getting off of fossil fuels, actually we'll be in a much worse situation than we find ourselves in now, and we'll probably have less resources to deal with it. So really, today we are in a climate crisis. We can't wait until 2030 or 2040, because then in reality, it's too late. The other point I want to make is that during the South Africa divestment struggle in the 80s, which I also was very active in, I initially actually first became involved in social justice issues around the civil rights movement. First organization I ever belonged to, and I even supported the war at the time when I first got involved. I was indoctrinated as a Cold War kid in the 50s. But the first group I ever joined was SCLC, which was Dr. King's organization. And I was in that organization when Dr. King was alive. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is I had fought against racial injustice for years when the anti-apartheid movement came to a head. And there again, divestment was very, very important, but the only thing that got divestment going and on the ground was mass protests, okay? It wasn't just quietly lobbying and signing petitions, and all that's very important. But if you don't, I hate to say it, cause a certain amount of disruption of the system, fundamental change doesn't happen. And here we are talking about fundamental change. We could see in this pandemic crisis how Trump is trying to put profits before people, stopping the shutdowns, now rushing to bring the shutdowns around, recommending the use of bogus drugs because he has investments and his cronies and partners in crime have investments in these companies. I mean, the profit drive and how destructive it is runs through this whole pandemic. And the same we could say about the climate crises. Now, in building, am I over time, by the way, friends? No? Okay. In building our movement, we need to take advantage and realize, first of all, the first thing I want to say is it can't come from elites. It's like I said, it's going to come from the ground up. But it's important that we realize that we have allies in the elites, even if they don't want to go all the way right now necessarily. Even if they only support Band-Aid solutions, it could be a step forward, get us the support and the ear of many of the more enlightened corporate sections in this country. And it's important to take advantage of these contradictions amongst the elite in order to make strides forward, which is one of the reasons why I support, even though I'm very critical of all these resolutions of the cities calling a climate emergency with no teeth behind the resolutions. My only main problem with it is that sometimes we dress up politicians as if they're really doing something significant, when in reality they're blocking significant change, like the Miami City Commission, which, while passing a resolution around a climate emergency, has supported all kinds of climate gentrification to displace poor people. As we've seen in Little Haiti, in Overtown, and Liberty City, a lot of that gentrification is driven by climate change. And basically, it's only to further the social inequities that we already have. But the point, to get back to my point, it's
2-minute warning there, just to let you know.
Okay. It's important to take advantage of these contradictions in order to build our movement in a broader way and try to push the more enlightened elements of the elite, of the corporate world, and of the political establishment more in our direction. Because it's a gradual, while on the one hand, we need at certain times to have breaks and radical change very quickly, really what leads up to any kind of change like that is gradual change as well. And that's why it's important to build a very broad-based movement. And it's important that in that movement, there be groups like 350 that really don't bend when it comes to certain principles, like no investment in fossil fuels. But it's also important to unite with other forces that we can compromise on certain measures about and move forward to fight for those measures in the hopes and in the anticipation and preparation to build for bigger change. And again, I'm not going to go on anymore, but the whole Green New Deal is really fundamental of what we need to fight for. But perhaps in the question and answers, we could deal with that.
Thank you very much, Jack. Are there any questions? Okay, we'll continue now. Thank you very much, Jack, for sharing those thoughts and the different methods to bring about change. So in this slide, we can see a pathway and guidance for effective strategies that lead to victory. However, there's many different tactics in divestment and in any type of grassroots movement, and it's always within the local within the local and circumstantial context. However, our main message in this presentation is showing you how you and I can get involved and really see tangible results in these actions. So you and I can get involved in divestment now, and even though these personal stories seem far-fetched, it was just regular individuals like ourselves, and we want to invite you to also be a part of this. So, let's go to the next slide. So these are all examples of divestment movement. Share my personal story. Divestment and activism gives me hope. It keeps me. And I know when I started activism, it almost felt hopeless, learning more and more about the overwhelming climate crisis. And as an activist, how are you going to compete with these powerful giants that have enough money to sue you, arrest you, threaten you? For example, in schools, many classmates got suspended, and like Jack shared, suspended as well and arrested. And it can really be overwhelming. And despite this is a tactic, we're not at all suggesting that it's necessary. What is necessary is the collective movement, and the collective movement really goes a long way. What we're trying to show is how collective movement really has changed the world. All civil rights movements, environmental movements, and now growing more than ever, the divestment movement. So how I first got involved with divestment was when I went to University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. There was a 350 chapter there. That's when I first got involved with 350, and the 350 group strongly advocated for divestment and for climate justice. So the first divestment campaign took 5 years. It was a long process, student-led process, and after many different strategies and many activists and hours of persistence and dedication, the first victory the student-led movement achieved was a 380 million divestment, which is only 1% of the endowment fund. So again, like Jack mentioned, despite this being like a victory and a lot of the leaders, the board of governors were happy to please the students, that clearly wasn't enough. 1% is not at all where we need to be. So this movement kept growing, and just like the environmental movement that is growing, all that pressure, the students, the faculty, all got involved. So there were many different strategies you can see in the next slide. So we had sittings in the Board of Governors, banner drops, all types of strikes, marches. We even have a hunger strike. That's even a little bit more radical. But anyway, after all these different tactics, finally the Board of Governors just this past November decided to fully divest. And adding to what Jack was saying is all these actions are incredibly necessary. Otherwise, the Board of Governors would never do this. They have so many commitment with so many fossil fuel industry, but that pressure was so much of the students that they literally had their hands tied and had no option but to divest. So that is how we need to approach our leaders, or whoever has to make the decision making. We have to leave them no choice. And also within the movement and within the steps that were mentioned previously, the movement needs to have teeth. It needs to have something tangible where you need to show results. So whether that be a referendum, whether you get a petition. So in our case, we had 60% of the students and faculty signed. So these were this is a school of 60,000 students, thousands of participants signed the petition, the referendum, and the Board of Governors had no option. So I was personally shocked that after years and years of pressuring, what seemed impossible is now a reality. And people power is real. And by acting together, sharing resources and strategies and experiences, we grow. So that is the intention of this webinar now, that hopefully these stories can spark some inspiration to other people, and we can all come together and share resources. So these are other victories And I personally think this is super exciting how the world is shifting. And if we continue to demand this change, we'll see it happen. So Eric mentioned it in the introduction, but since I was talking about universities, 182 educational institutions have fully divested. Some of those, Oxford, California, Brown University, Seattle University. This is amazing. Partial divestment from Stanford, Cambridge, Yale, Columbia University. And the reason is people pressure, and also, as Jack mentioned, because it's economically feasible. We are no longer in a fossil fuel era. There's so much corporate interest and power that has tied us and have left us stuck in this era, but we're no longer there, especially if we want a sound future for future generations. So 170 governments, institutions, cities, states, towns, some examples, Paris, San Francisco, Seattle, and even Ireland. That's the first and only country to fully divest. So as Eric mentioned, all these institutions, whether it be a city, whether it be a university, whether it be a faith group, any type of, they have funds invested. So these are, as Jack mentioned, $14 trillion have been divested. And this is how we change. Money speaks, right? So if there's no money in fossil fuels, people will start divesting. It's just an economically. So that's where we need to make it clear. We need to also demand this change for our future for environmental reasons, but also for economic reasons, and just limit those political ties. So thank you. And now we will lead to our third presenter, Eric.
Do you have questions for Nicole? Before I get on there, does anyone have any questions for Nicole? No. Okay. So yeah, basically I'll be focusing on some of the bad actors here. Who is financing the fossil fuel industry? Well, it turns out Wall Street and fossil fuel companies are, best of friends. And so basically there's like three different aspects of the financial industry that supports fossil fuel projects with investment dollars. And first is asset funds. So this is like mutual funds and pension funds, that kind of thing. The second is insurance companies. All of these projects need insurance. You can't build a oil rig or pipeline without insurance. And the third is banks. So this collectively is these three types of industries, financial industries, collectively make up a huge part of the economy. And that's why this overall campaign is often called Stop the Money Pipeline. Because if we can stop some of the financing of these fossil fuel projects and make it unfeasible, then we're going to see a lot more investment in renewable energy and carbon-free energy. So yeah, basically the message is that for a lot of these three types of financial institutions is we need to send a message from consumers that we need them to be divesting from fossil fuel projects, and also to recognize that fossil fuel is a long-term bad investment. So we'll be focusing on BlackRock, Liberty Mutual, and JP Morgan Chase as the three industry leaders in their respective fields. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, so first, BlackRock might be the fossil fuel funder you haven't heard of. BlackRock is an asset management company. They, create mutual funds and various investment funds for individuals, for pensions, for endowments, etc. Basically, they have collectively as a industry, asset managers control about $90 trillion of capital, which is kind of insane number. And BlackRock is the largest, which has about $6.5 trillion under its management. Out of that, we see about $90 billion of BlackRock's investments are in fossil fuel portfolios. So this includes, oil, coal, natural gas, pipeline, infrastructure, all anything and everything related to the fossil fuel industry. And basically, the demand has been from BlackRock to divest in these companies and to prioritize, options for consumers, for investors that are fossil-free funds. So if you are wanting to, put money in your 401k, it would be great if you could invest it in something that does not include fossil fuel companies, which up until now has been difficult because the transparency, which is another aspect of the demands, hasn't been all that clear. Also, the push has been on getting BlackRock to push the companies that it owns shares in to align their goals with the Paris Climate Agreement. So can we go to the next slide, please? The good news is that a lot of this pressure has been successful, and we have groups, like Rainforest Action Network, 350, a whole number of other, small and local nonprofits and, groups that have been fighting, like the Keystone XL pipeline, et cetera. They have been putting a lot of pressure on these companies. And late last year, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink released this letter, which highlights the fact that our efforts have been making an impact. In fact, in the red underlined section there, you can see that he mentions the September climate strike protests as a factor in getting his company to start rethinking how they invest in their funds and whether or not fossil fuel companies are a good investment. It's clearly pointed out right here, climate risk is an investment risk. And he believes that the financial industry is on the edge of a fundamental reshaping. So this is good. Clearly we're starting to get the message through to the heads of industry that fossil fuels are a bad investment financially and from a PR standpoint as well. So clearly in that last column there, we do want to see a significant reallocation of capital, and it's great to see that it's already starting to happen, but it hasn't happened without the pressure from the public and the pressure from folks who, like us. So the good news is that so far, we've seen, agreements from BlackRock to basically divest in a lot of coal, work to increase the transparency of their funds so that people can see where fossil fuels might be part of their investment packages, and also they're really creating more fossil fuel free investment portfolios and urging people to start investing in those. So this is a step in the right direction. It's clearly not the end result that we want, but it's definitely moving in that direction. So the next industry we have is insurance. So this basically is the second largest pool of money in the investing economy, representing $31 trillion. Definitely, insurance industry is a huge, a huge investor. Second only to the asset managers. 600 billion of that is in coal, gas, and other fossil fuel projects as an industry. And the industry leader for that is Liberty Mutual with about $9 billion. Actually, if we can go back real quick first. The thing about can we go back? Oh, yeah. So the thing about the insurance companies, though, is that there's a major irony here in that they're investing customer premiums in fossil fuel companies and in the insurance that the fossil fuel companies need to build their projects. And a lot of those companies are the same insurers that people are buying their flood and wind and storm insurance from. So literally, the money that you're spending to insure your house against climate change fuel disasters is being refunneled into furthering this dilemma. furthering the climate crisis. And there's this great quote here by Bill McKibben, founder of 350, that highlights that this is a perverse loop that allows insurers to facilitate polluting projects that cause global warming, while at the same time providing the insurance against the climate impacts of those same projects. So yeah, next slide. So Liberty Mutual is one of the biggest insurance companies in America. They have a huge financial backer of the tar sands projects, which are largely up in like Canada and that area. One of the dirtiest oil projects that we can still extract, one of the dirtiest places we can still extract oil from. And Bill McKibben has called this the climate bomb if we actually start to open that up to into drilling, and then also to transport from Alberta, et cetera, into the rest of the U.S. and other ports for other places for export via the use of pipelines like the Keystone XL pipeline and the Dakota Access Pipeline and Line 3 for as some examples. So Liberty Mutual has about $9 billion invested in fossil fuel companies, $30 million in bonds for the Keystone XL pipeline in itself. And the demand really is very simple. Just we want them to stop insuring tar sands and to phase out fossil fuel expansions and strengthen what they've already committed to do, which is phasing out investment in coal projects. So that is a bright spot, is that last year they did agree to phase out investment in coal, again, because of massive public pressure like we see here. Next slide. Okay, so our last industry that we're focusing on is the banking sector. So banks have invested about $2.7 trillion in fossil fuels since 2016. And as you can see from the chart here, that the four largest investors in fossil fuel projects are US banks: JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Citi, and Bank of America. JP Morgan Chase is by far the largest funder of fossil fuel projects. It's got about $270 billion invested in the last 4 years. And that is basically like a third higher than the second worst, which is Wells Fargo. And since the Paris Climate Agreement, a lot of these banks, including Chase, have only increased their investments in fossil fuel projects. So next slide, please. The good news is that, again, due to public pressure, Chase has agreed to halt the financing of of Arctic oil projects, as well as the funding of most coal-powered power plants. Excuse me. Again, only because of massive public pressure from groups like 350 and Rainforest Action Network and the Sierra Club. Next slide. Okay, so that's actually it for me. But so the summary from the financial sector is that Arctic oil and coal are on their way out as financially unfeasible, unprofitable, and bad investments. Still up is things like fracking, tar sands, and other fossil fuel infrastructure projects like pipeline. So we've had victories, but we still have a long way to go. And again, it's that public pressure that's going to make all the difference there. So that leads us into how we can move our money from fossil fuel intensive into better sources.
Okay. Yeah, so when we think about what can we do in terms of, investing our own money, there's a lot of things that we need to think about. And some of the, obviously one that we have been highlighting is that we want to invest our money into places that are fossil fuel free. But there are other values to consider. And these are, for example, some of them these are things that I myself are going through as I look to remove money out of certain credit cards and from my bank. There might be other values that you want to look at, such as, for example, banks, institutions that are funding low-income communities or that have values that resonate with you in terms of, having equity values in, maybe you want to invest in companies that are, owned by people of color. So there's all kinds of things for you to consider, how you are going to invest your money. Next. Okay. And so there's several resources that that have been put together. There's going to be, and I know that Nicole shared that a little bit later, or a little earlier in the chat. There's certain resources that you can definitely use to look at where you can put your funding. These are some of them that we've listed in there. And really the key thing is you think through about where to invest. Again, align the values. There's a lot of resources out there to figure out where you can shift your money to. And so if we go to the next slide, I'll show you, for example, go to the next one. Oh, let me see, is that there? Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. So this is just kind of going through, for example, what I've been going through. And I have to thank Susan Steinheiser, who I believe she's on the call, who put together this carbon footprint inventory. And that's something that I myself will be going through and looking at my credit cards and all the other different investments that I have to look at, which banks I need to move money away from. There's resources in there that you can explore. And if you go to the next slide, okay, I'll show, for example, one of them that I looked at was an article from 2017 that is still kind of relevant. And you see it in there, several companies that are US based. I know from several people that I have spoken with, Aspiration, Beneficial State Bank are some of the most common ones that I know people, in fact, some of the people on the call, I might be using some of them. First Green Bank happens to be here in Florida, based, I believe, in Fort Lauderdale. And again, there's other choices in there. So next slide. Okay. Another thing to consider, usually smaller banks, community banks, credit unions, not all of them, but certainly the majority of them tend to really not be investing heavy or at all in any fossil fuels. And one of those programs, which is certified by the U.S. Department of Treasury, is the Community Development Finance Institutions. And basically, these are institutions that their primary purpose is to help disadvantaged communities. And I happen, again, because I'm going through this whole thing myself as to where I'm going to move my money, I noticed that there were, some of the things to consider. For example, on my end, I want to make sure that I get a bank with very low balance, or very, low balance or no balance requirements, that has things like bill pay. But for me, for example, it's important to move my money to credit cards where, for example, the APR is low. And most importantly for me, since I have some high balances in some old credit cards, is that there'll be no balance transfer fees. And there appears to be within the list that I looked in there, there was at least 2 banks that, from what I saw on the website, appear to not have that. And I believe 2 of those are Guardians Credit Union and Jetstream Federal Credit Union. And again, that's just a sampling. There might be others, but those are things that to consider, as you look to. One thing, I point to this is, when we look at divestment, it's important to realize that, as long as somebody wants to divest, the next step is really educating yourself, because there are a lot of resources out there to figure out how to do it. But also we need to acknowledge and realize that there's different circumstances that people are at. And so it might take, for somebody, they might be able to divest right away. And for others, it might take a little longer as they figure out, a place that is going to make financial sense for them and aligns with their values. Next slide. Okay. And regardless of whether or not you're ready to divest this week, obviously today, the second day of EarthDayLive. The focus is on the financing that goes to climate disruption, or climate destructions. And this is a very easy thing that everybody can do today. And this was put together by Elizabeth O'Neill and with assistance from some other volunteers, Marcia Miami group. And this is just really easy. You know, Twitter, as you probably all know, there's a certain person that sits in the White House that loves to tweet. So we know Twitter is something that tends to get the attention of CEOs and as well as the media. So this is one of the ways, you know, just very simple. We've given you examples of things that you can tweak and tag them. We've also given you the emails of the CEOs from these 3 big bad actors, as well as sample letters that when you hit them, you know, you can, and that's all part of the resource that that Nicole had shared. And these phone numbers, you know, I know for sure that some of them go directly to, you know, very close to the offices of the CEOs. And this is a no-brainer to do. And I really want to encourage you all, if you do nothing else today, to at least do one of these steps today. And I think I'm done on my end, and I'm ready for questions. I don't know if you want to go to the next slide or not. Yeah, and let's see, do we have any questions? Okay, somebody said in the chat, pointed out that another local credit union is University Credit Unions. They're open to anyone as long as you have a connection with University of Miami or FIU. So that's a good thing to know, that there's educational type credit unions as a choice. So that's good. And any other questions that people have?
Yes, we encourage participation. If anyone wants to share any comments or any question, there's no good or bad question, so we invite anyone to participate.
I would challenge those that are listening, if you're ready to look at these resources, if there's one of these that you're ready to start looking into divesting, I am planning to definitely do it. You know, I have, unfortunately, I do have 2 credit cards that are with bad actors, and I'm definitely going to be using these resources to make that change over the next month or so. So I'll be curious if anybody else.
Susan wanted to say something. Did you have a?
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, so it was just too much to type, sorry, in the chat. So when I did my personal inventory, I was really surprised that I had a credit card held by Barclays, which was on that list. It's number 10. And it turns out it's a JetBlue MasterCard. Now, there are a lot of people who have that credit card, because when JetBlue first came out, they're like, any snowbird has a JetBlue MasterCard, because they fly New York, Florida. So to get an action together of people to start writing to JetBlue saying, we love your credit card, we want to keep using it, but you need to find a different bank, or you need to get Barclays to stop investing. What do you suggest would be the best way to start that? Like email the world, hey, do you have a JetBlue MasterCard? Or go to the JetBlue terminal at, you know, Fort Lauderdale and hand out flyers? Or what do you do? Well, when we can go again.
I would say that, you know, I think social media is a great tool for that. So, you know, you can just make a post, you can take a picture of yourself, like literally cutting the card, and just, you know, tag the financial institution that owns that, and then call their customer service number, which I just posted in the chat, and tell them that you want to, why you're canceling your account.
Yeah. I know for sure that corporations pay attention to social media, and I could just share like two quick examples. One of which was actually related to JetBlue. It was not to do with the credit card per se, but it was something that was happening at the terminal, and there were a lot of people upset. We all went into social media, into Twitter, and we started tweeting, tagging JetBlue, and sure enough, they were responding. So you get a few people, they respond, and I had a similar circumstance with something silly. There was a bad light pole outside that happens to be owned by FPL, and I started tagging them, and sure enough, they responded back. And just to give one more example, just a couple of 2 weeks ago or so, for instance, there was the problem with 3M, that in terms of having masks for health workers, and so one of these people that work in emergency management started tagging 3M in Twitter, and sure enough, about the next day they were responding. So definitely, I'm a huge advocate for putting pressure on social media to JetBlue. Yeah. Any other questions we have in here?
I just wanted to add another quick example. This is a little bit more large scale, but it's this company in Japan. I just wrote it in the chat box. Their customers were just mentioning to customer service that they didn't want Blackrock's funds. So it was something like the JetBlue example. It was indirect. So it was not necessarily people who had invested in Blackrock, but rather their funds, a Japanese fund that worked with Blackrock. So they expressed that so here in the chat you can see, arguing that environment, social, and government issues must be taken into consideration as part of their investment ethos. So they withdrew 1.5 trillion US dollars. So that's all customer service, and that's all the values that they put forth, right? So again, money speaks, and if it's not economically feasible, that's a very tangible way. And I think the JetBlue, like, I know I didn't know that, so it's very useful sometimes to just dig in a little and find the connections and just speak up with media or customer service. And yeah,
That's good.
yes, thank you for asking, Susan. Are there any more questions before we wrap up?
I just posted a link in the chat of a cool little video that another 350 chapter made about, people cutting up their cards. So it's a good example of how you can do this kind of grassroots action.
Yeah. Yeah, and definitely something to point out is if you do divest, move your credit card. I would even say that even if you're thinking about doing it, you're going through the research process, let them know, hey, I'm looking into my options. Are you got, you might force them to say that, well, we're looking into, they might not do it right away, but they might be able to try, to do something, at least you hope. So definitely let them know while you're researching and in the process, and definitely do it after you do it, for sure.
And Dottie just posted in chat that she belongs to the UM Credit Union and has kept only that card while cutting up 2 other ones. So great job, Dottie. Thank you.
Okay, good. All right.
Thank you for that, Dottie, and for joining us, everyone, for joining us. Just as a quick heads up, people are welcome to include their email in the chat box if they want to learn more. We can send them the resources and just stay on the loop with this divestment movement. This is also being recorded, and it will be available in our YouTube 350 South Florida channel. And if there's no further questions, I just want to thank everyone for being here, to all our speakers, and for giving us hope in this divestment movement and in these harsh times. So thank you all for showing your solidarity.
Yeah. Thank you, Nicole.
Can we just show the last slide again for folks who want more information? Today's Earth Day Live is all about fossil fuel divestment. So there's there's been tons of things happening today, and there will be through, like 8 o'clock tonight. And then these other two websites, Go Fossil Fuel Free or Stop the Money Pipeline, are really excellent resources for pretty much everything that we've talked about. So.
That's good. Somebody
Thank
has
you
to
very
clap.
much.
Thank you.
With our Florida
Bye-bye.
collage, No Fossil Fuel Day Loud, and keep the good work. Thank you all, and see you soon.